So today we got the Unit 7 review for AP World History. This unit focuses a lot on the Great Wars and just shifting power in general over the early 1900s. Um, so just to start off, general shifts in power before the wars. The Ottomans. So the Ottomans, like we talked about, they kind of goes along with the Qing in a second. They are already weakening because they didn't have like good industrializations, and reforms are attempted, but as we know, they're not incredibly effective compared to the other European powers. So by now, the Young Turks have totally got power, but they are alienating many of the ethnic groups in the empire, and they basically kill off the Ottoman Empire as a whole, and just make like after World War One, they'll just make Turkey into a thing. So they're kind of like weakening the Ottomans in general. Russia, very industrialized, but they had done it under a Tsar named Nicholas II, who is brutally treating serfs and, well, like former serfs, and the working class. Basically, he was brutalizing them in a way that's like they weren't getting paid much, but they were doing extremely difficult labor. Technically, they were being paid, but it was not like living really. Um, so there's a revolution during World War One, which draws Russia out of the war, and it's a communist revolution. I believe it's here later, but it turns Russia into the Soviet Union. But it does take them out of the war about a year before its end, in 1917, over when it ended in 1918. Like I just said, so the Qing were weakening. They had the Taiping Rebellion, basically destroyed the entire country. Not entire. That's a huge exaggeration. Destroyed like a lot of the country because a lot of people died because the Taiping Rebellion has like had a bunch of people who were revolting, and they needed a bunch of people to stop their revolt. So there was basically a lot of Chinese people just kind of were fighting each other, and a lot of them unfortunately did die. And it also really destroyed the economy of China because there was a lot of land out there that they just couldn't use because it was under Taiping control. The Opium Wars also obviously weakened the Qing, and the Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, these also just continue to weaken the Chinese. So then Sun Yat-sen, he revolts against the Chinese, and he ends the dynasty, and then he doesn't really do much, and then shortly after he kind of destroys the dynasties, Mao Zedong, he gains power and establishes a communist China after another revolt. Um, and then we have Mexico. It's like run by a guy named Porfirio Diaz. Sorry, this is spelled wrong. But basically, he's like a pretty bad dictator. Like, I mean, obviously, um, but people did not really like him. So, uh, because like he kind of was like getting kind of angering all the social classes, he got ousted because there was like a big power struggle between some elites in the government, between some people who were in the middle class but were like still prominent figures, and it was a very brutal civil war. There was like a bunch of different governments. Almost every year there was like multiple people vying for government and like multiple different people. Um, and eventually, by the end of the war, they emerge with a constitution, which is a good thing. The Constitution is still in use today, and this is kind of what started the Mexico we know today. So overall, the revolution was good for them. It did strengthen them technically, but it was a very brutal set of wars. So then we get into the cause of World War One, which very easily fits under Maine, which is militarism, which is basically the idea that you should strengthen your own military. If you strengthen your military, it's good for the state. It's good for everybody. The state benefits, you benefit. Great thing all around. It's caused by alliances, which we'll get in down. I'll explain this a bit more here. But there was two main alliances, which were the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers, and then the Trientente, or Trientente. I don't really know. It's French, but they were the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and then the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers, were at first supposed to be Germany, Italy, and Austria. Italy doesn't actually join the war until later, and they join on the Allies side. They're kind of crazy. So for the beginning of the war, it's mostly just Germany and Austria, and then eventually the Ottomans actually join the Central Powers. So they kind of like switch up there a bit. And then there's industrialization and imperialism. Both sort of mean the same thing in this context, so you can kind of use both of them for the eye. Basically, the powers were getting like more industrialized. They were making more war stuff, and they were imperializing more, which means they were getting more resources to make more war stuff. Either way, they have more access to equipment to go to war with, more weapons, more vehicles. Um, so they're just more able to actually go into a war, and it's like just a kind of good. It's not like a horrible thing in their eyes. And then nationalism is, I mean, we all know the idea that like your nation, you're kind of like one with the nation. It's like your nation is the best, and you want to kind of expand it, which kind of goes into militarism, industrialization, imperialism, sort of with alliances. Not, it's a bit iffy, but also mainly is for this spark of war. So um, basically, prior to this, Austria-Hungary was a pretty big empire, and Serbia. Were both like kind of empires around the Balkans area. Austria is obviously Austria-Hungary is centered near, more closer to Austria and Hungary, but it's reached down into the Balkans to modern Croatia, to modern like that's actually a pretty good one. Yeah, just Croatia. Um, and they actually just recently took over Bosnia and Herzegovina actually, but um, kind of focusing on Bosnia. So Serbia had actually wanted to do the same thing, especially nationalist groups like the Black Hand. They were really wanting to start their own empire, so they were like kind of gunning for Bosnia. So when Austria took it, they were kind of upset by that, and they were like, "Hey, you just took our Bosnia. Like, you can't do that." Um, and the Austrians obviously they were like, okay, well we took it, so it's just ours. So while parading in a motorcade, Franz Ferdinand, an archduke, he is shot by a member of the Black Hand, an assassin named Gavrilo Princip, who obviously Serbian nationalist, and this kind of booms an entire war because even though this like assassination was honestly pretty like low key, like it was not like that deep, it kind of like started a whole thing where because of the nationalism of this guy, um, they were kind of able in like the imperialism of Austria. It set a huge chain of alliances declaring war on each other. So it was the order might be a bit messed up, but I believe Austria declared war on Serbia for killing the guy, and then Russia declared war on Austria for because they wanted to protect a Slavic nation. So it was Austria to Serbia, Russia to Austria, then Germany to Russia because they wanted to protect the Austrians, and then France to Germany because France to Germany and the UK to Germany kind of because they were like, hey, you can't fight Russia, that's our guy. And then from there, basically everybody just kind of declared war on each other after that because they are already there. Um, Pretty bad. And then obviously they were kind of able to do that because strong militaries through militarism and able to have that strong military through industrialization. So, kind of fits out the entire acronym, including both eyes. So, World War One is one of the first total wars in history. Total war means the entire population is in some way mobilized to fight in this war. Obviously, soldiers throughout history are fighting in the war, but unlike previously, civilians are also mobilized. They need to be creating things as far as the nation sees. They need to be making the stuff for the army. They should be thinking about the army. If they're eating something, well, the army could be eating that. They should ration. If they are wearing like fancy clothes, well, I mean, you don't need fancy clothes. You should be kind of saving cloth and stuff for the army. You should be doing things for the army, and you should kind of devote your life to helping the army if you aren't fighting. There's also plenty of new technologies. There's machine guns, which are mounted on top of trenches to kind of rain down fire as there's approaching soldiers. There's gas, which became illegal, but the main kind of gas basically caused like inflammatories. Like it kind of like in. I don't really know what the term would be. I'm not a medical major, but it like inflamed the lungs, so they would like grow up inside of their bodies after it mixed with the water, and it would kind of like suffocate people because they obviously couldn't breathe. Their all their like airways were kind of blocked. Tanks. I believe I forget what his last name was, but I think his first name was Pancho. He was like he was one of like the Mexican leaders from the revolution. He actually had put a machine gun on the back of a truck, and like was highly mobile with it, and it was like really effective. So eventually, that technology they kind of were like, hey, what if we just put that in a box? and, and that's kind of like what happened with tanks. So they were kind of designed to like go over trenches easier. And even though they were kind of slow at this point, they were like at first equipped with mainly just machine guns to go against infantry, and then just a bigger gun to shoot other tanks and shoot like defenses for the trenches. They were kind of hugely used. Planes, not super important in this war, but you know, they were in existence. They weren't specialized yet, though. Basically, there was biplanes, and then there was biplanes, and then you know, if you were feeling a bit silly, you might have a biplane. But some biplanes did have bombs. Some had like four machine guns instead of the normal two, but it was not like they weren't really different. And then submarines were also in this war. Like this is the I think probably the closest thing to the modern submarine. Like this is probably like the first time I would consider a submarine modern, because they could like actually, yeah, they were very effective underwater and they were heavily used, especially by the Germans. Called They had their submarines called U-boats or Unterseeboots. So yeah, they were using them a lot, trying to stop trade in like lend lease and trade between the Americas and Britain. I think I have that in World War II, but I can honestly explain it now. Lend lease is basically just like, hey, we're not going to get in the war, but you know, if you pay us a little bit of money, we can kind of cut a deal here, and we can give you some weapons and stuff. Or maybe you could have like some boats. Like it was sort of just like a trade deal. But it was kind of helpful, especially if, like, I know the U.S. in both World Wars was doing lend lease before they actually joined because they wanted to help their like allies, but they also like neither war they wanted to get into, and they were kind of like forced into each one. So the primary thing here, the main way they were fighting, like I mentioned with the machine guns about trenches, trench warfare was incredibly common, which is it's they would drag like kind of like diagonal-ish trenches, like a lot of like different turns in them that were made them easy to defend, and then they would be able to kind of like sit under them during artillery fire or like during nighttime, and they could kind of secure the position. And this made war incredibly slow. Trenches were also just dangerous because like there was a thing called trench foot, which is because the trenches were too wet. They didn't really have a great infrastructure, so they kind of like people would get diseases and die because the ground was too wet in the trenches. Um, like trenches were kind of like the most deadly thing in this war. It feels like. But obviously machine guns, they were mounted on top, and there was in between trenches, it was called no man's land, and they would set up barbed wire, and just kind of like either you got entangled or you went around, but that gave the machine guns time to shoot you. It was not like a good war environment at all. Not that there are good war environments, but this one was especially bad because it was really slow, and like hundreds of people would die, maybe even thousands, for like 2 meters of land, and it was like, okay, great, we've done so much here. um, and this war also had a lot of colonial troops. Colonial troops were brought in because of so many people dying. So the different imperial powers were like, "Hey, you guys in this colony, you guys should come help us in Europe with the war." And this actually did this was working. They were able to actually kind of get troops in. Um, but it did kind of make the troops, like the colonial people, kind of want more independence because they helped fight in the war, and they were like, "Hey, we just helped you win this war. We should have a bit of autonomy now." Which, I mean, fair enough. This was also one of the first big widespread uses of propaganda, at least as far as the AP curriculum is kind of concerned. Um, they would basically use like nationalist ideas and villainize the enemy, which also made their struggle seem like, or like their war effort to seem more like a struggle for good or the struggle for their nation, which kind of helped with the total war. Just with all like the, hey, we need you to fight with us, and this is why, because the enemy is bad, so you should help. And then this kind of ended with the Treaty of Versailles, which was absolutely horrible. Probably I would say, one of the worst treaties in human history, which is maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but not even really. Because it didn't do much to reduce tensions, which I feel like is kind of the point of a treaty. Um, it basically just it effectively dissolved Austria, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, effectively dissolved the Ottoman Empire, and then it just like destroyed Germany. They had to pay war reparations. They had to demilitarize. They could only have 100,000 like land troops, and strictly was just they couldn't have an air force. I think the navy was also like heavily limited. Um, they could only have 100,000 troops, including officers. So like the 100,000 includes all of their command and like organizing them. So they had less than 100,000 like actual like kind of infantry units that were supposed to not supposed to die, but like seen as a bit more disposable, I guess. Just kind of a grim way of looking at it. And that army could only be used for defending the borders and for like use inside of the country. The Allies were kind of like the yeah, I guess the Allies is the term. Um, they were kind of like, yeah, I guess if you want to use your army for yourself, you can do that, but you just can't go attack anybody. They also had to accept complete guilt for the war, which is a bit unfair considering that, first of all, the Serbian guy shot the Austrian guy, and then Austria declared war first, and then Russia declared war on them, which was the first like alliance to declare war. Like three whole people came before Germany. I don't know why they got blamed, but hey, I guess they committed a lot of war crimes, so fair enough. Um, and they also lost like a bunch of land. It was really like they lost so much. One of the worst offenses, well, two of the worst offenses, not loss completely of land, but the demilitarization of the Rhineland kind of hurt Germany, especially because since they couldn't have an army in there according to the treaty, if somebody else wanted to take it, they could kind of just walk in and take it. There wasn't anything really stopping them because there was no German army. And the other one was the Polish corridor, which is also a bit of an issue with the Danzig. Um, and basically, this that like split Germany, not in half, but like it kind of split a part off of Germany, kind of like that was wrapped in Poland. And that really was like horror. That one really upset the Germans because they were like, "Hey, what the heck? Like, we need to connect to our ourselves. Like, what are they doing over there?" Because it was a really big chunk of land that was like disconnected. It wasn't like a small enclave or anything. So yeah, this treaty pretty bad. Um, I'd rate it like a 3 out of 10 on the treaty scale. It did it in the First World War, so I got to give it that. It failed everything else. Um, so then we have the interwar period. Horrible. Every this is all you need to know really. Everything is on fire. Everything is bad. So the reasons the global depression basically destroys the entire world economy because the U.S. stock market crashes in 1929. And the U.S. had previously been kind of giving money to the Allied powers and saying, "Hey, you should like rebuild your nation with this. Like we have a great economy." And also, the U.S. controlled tons of the world economy at this point. So when the U.S. lost their economy, there was a couple different effects. Obviously, since they had such a big share of the global economy, that kind of hurt things. And then on top of that, the European powers, they also like they had just spent the money, but now the U.S. is asking for it back. So now they were kind of pushing more demands on Germany, but also they were kind of in debt. On top of that, remember dependent economies? They're dependent on the big powers, and the big powers are now all in debt. So now all the dependent economies also in debt. So the entire world is just in debt because of the stock market crash. On top of that, you have the Spanish flu starting, especially around 1920, which really hurts tons of people across Europe. It was catching on near the end of World War One, but now it's like almost pandemic level. Um, this is the date isn't super important, but basically, if you did want to remember it, you can kind of just remember that we just had a big outbreak of disease from 1820, 1920, and 2020, which is such an interesting little thing. Um, so yeah, so then down here we have German war reparations. Like I said, really bad, especially now that the European powers are now pushing even more on Germany. They're like, hey, we need money now. German inflation also is doing horrible because for some reason the German government decided to print more money, which doesn't make any sense if you know anything about economics. Because if you print more money, then the money just goes down, and I forget the exact number, but I'm pretty sure like one US dollar was like 40 trillion or something. It was insane. Like 40 trillion marks for a single US dollar. Um, and then back to America, banks are dying incredibly quickly. A lot of them are failing because they had lent money a bit extravagantly. But now, because of layoffs due to the Great Depression, because nobody had all the companies were starting to run out of money because people were selling stocks, they kind of hurt even more because now people couldn't pay money back. Banks closed, people lost even more money. On top of that, you had the Dust Bowl and droughts, which destroyed all the farms like in America, not all, but it really hurt them. Um, which meant that they had less food. farmers were also starting to run out of jobs, which led to even more unemployment. And yeah, like most of this is starts in the U.S., but it catches like fire across the rest of the world. So then there's a few different plans to make everything a bit better. One of the best ones probably was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He introduces the New Deal, which is basically like a set of different acts that achieves a bunch of different things, but it's just collectively known as the New Deal. So first, there was jobs and infrastructure for government jobs. Um, One interesting connection is you kind of think about this like the Meta system that the Incans used, where they would kind of like give people government jobs. Not exactly like it. It's not like the best connection, but it's somewhat similar. Um, there's also government retirement programs and Social Security are kind of implemented to kind of help alleviate stress upon people. And same thing with medical insurance for the elderly and children. Also, just alleviates a bit of stress from people when it comes to like protecting themselves. Which this is like a pretty popular deal. He became a really popular president, especially because of this. It's actually part of the reason why he was elected was completely just because he was like, "Hey, I'm gonna do this," and people were like, "Yes, yes, let's. That sounds great." Um, so yeah, this is a pretty good way of doing things. It doesn't completely end the depression, but nothing does until after World War II. It just really helps the U.S. kind of get back into things. Then there's also Vladimir Lenin. These two are a lot worse in what they were doing. So Vladimir Lenin and the Soviet Union, the Joseph Stalin, they create the new economic plan, the 5 year plan. Vladimir, like Lenin, is the new economic plan, which isn't as important. Stalin is the 5 year plans. The 5 year plans they aimed to uh, like increase the Soviet economy fivefold within 5 years, which is absolutely insane. Um, and it even though it doesn't completely get the entire economy up, it does actually somewhat work for the industrial might. The industrial might of the Soviet Union is like absolutely astounding. Like they still even today, Russia is like I think about half the tanks that they still have are still just from like the industrial might of the Soviet Union because they just made so many of them. Like the main tank that they used was called the T-34. It was not a remarkable tank by any means. It was a pretty average tank, but they made so many of them that like you just couldn't win. Like it's basically just like you kind of just got submerged. Like there wasn't much you could do. But unfortunately, this was also a really there were some really bad parts, of course. Mainly Holodomor, which we'll talk about a bit later. There's a section just for the atrocities, but this was caused by the 5 year plan, so I decided to put it here just to mention it. And then you had the Nazi industrialization. So Hitler had he privatized state-owned businesses so that like they were now privately owned businesses. um, he was able to kind of he I don't know. This was kind of I don't really know why exactly this works because I'm not like crazy with the economy, but he does that. And then he also like centralizes the economy based around militarism. So a lot of the industry is about the warfare economy, which also makes rationing of foods like poultry and fruit and clothing much more common because they weren't producing as much of them. They were mainly producing things that could help in a war. Um, which kind of is just the general idea of the Nazi industrialization, which a lot of this is also still done through like forced labor. At this point, it's not as bad. Like this was, I'm thinking of a perspective, but slightly before the camps, it wasn't like there wasn't tons. It was mostly just like these things. But obviously, we'll get into the really bad forced labor in a second. So there's a bit of unresolved tensions between uh, World War One and Two. Mainly colonies, they didn't get freedom. Like the mandate system, kind of supposed to give freedom. The idea was the League of Nations said, "Hey, you need help from a imperial power before you are politically and economically ready to be free. But we can like just kind of like you have your freedom in the books. Like it'll come soon." Um, Spoiler alert: freedom did not come soon. They just got owned by a new imperial power. This was mainly happening in the Ottoman Empire through the UK and France, especially. They did a lot of the mandates, And conquesting powers, they continue to increase, like Japan mainly, continues to increase their sphere of influence, even though the League of Nations was kind of saying, no, don't do that. But the League of Nations isn't good because they didn't have any way of like actually enforcing things. So they kind of just, it was like heavy finger wagging. You shouldn't do that, Japan. You stay out of Korea, Japan. And Japan did not stay out of Korea. They didn't stay out of anywhere actually. They kind of just kept going. And then there's anti-imperial resistance, not as much as like, I mean, this isn't like as important as I guess in previous units, but just little interesting things. One example, the Indian National Congress. This was more successful in the next couple units, but it starts around here, which is they were kind of like trying to petition to the British. They want more self rule, and they were like not really violent. It wasn't super effective, but they weren't violent, and it was like a nice thing. I'm pretty sure, or if I'm remembering right, this was the organization that Gandhi was a part of. Um, so yeah, they're just kind of there. So then here's the causes of World War II. Not a ton. The acronym's not really great. But the first thing was the unsustainable peace. This was Treaty of Versailles, basically. My God. All right. So Italy is denied, not like, I guess not denied, but they're not given promised land. They were promised like a lot more land in like modern day Croatia, like kind of along the coast of the Adriatic Sea. Um, and they are given a little bit, sort of like Slovenia, bits of Slovenia, a little bit of like what is in Croatia, but not that much. Not as much as they were thinking they'd get. So Italy's a bit mad about that, especially under Mussolini, and then Germany, like I said earlier, completely bullied into the ground. It is like this was just kind of like in the books, honestly. They were not happy with the Treaty of Versailles at all. So then there's the rise of fascism. Um, Italy, like I said, or I guess no, I said so they're kind of denied promised lands. So then Mussolini comes into power. He's an interesting character. So he's like a socialist originally, and he kind of like jumps between Switzerland and Italy a lot, mainly because he kept getting arrested and deported back to Italy, but he didn't want to do Italian military service, so he went back to Switzerland. But he was like an avid socialist. But then time he was kind of kicked out of the party after he became pro-war instead of anti-war, because he was thinking, well, hey, a big war like World War One could get Europe and the climate to destroy a bunch of these monarchies, and that'd be great for what I think politically. So he becomes pro-war. The socialists don't like him, and he's like, hey, okay, if you're going to kick me out of the Socialist Party, I'm just going to make my own party. So he actually is the developer of fascism, or what he called fascismo, which is like a hugely like nationalistic, hugely militaristic like political ideology, and it is like very incredibly far right. Germany, somewhat similar ish story, kind of like supposed to be socialist, and then basically just turns into a fascist dictatorship under Hitler. Both of these are sort of like elected by the people. Italy like takes control with the People's Army, and then they're like Mussolini, and then Hitler is directly elected by the people, and then he just kind of removes democracy um, after his election. And then Japan with I believe it was, God, I'm like blanking. Um, I can't remember the name, but their leader is like kind of building up like fascism too. Just kind of like not a fan of other races, which is another big thing. Fascism. They are like hugely built on race. So Japan, Germany, Italy are all very racist during this point. Japan, probably I would say like that was kind of their main thing. They were like, hey, Japan is better, so we're just gonna like expand our sphere of influence over the Pacific, and they kind of just did that. Also they just kind of became popular because they like people wanted more natural resources, mainly the government, but um, they just kind of became popular because they were expanding their territory and getting more natural resources. Um, and then there was the economic crisis, like before, like described with the on fire part. This just cooked like everybody. Um, it was kind of overall bad, but especially for Germany. Like I said, this kind of brings more about the unsustainable peace idea that Germany was kind of pushing. Like, hey, this is just, yeah, like, no. Actually, when Hitler comes to power, he just straight up stops paying war reparations. He just says no. And then just continued imperialism at this point. Still kind of a big thing. The main thing is Hitler's Lebensraum, which means living room, but like in the context of room for people to live. Um, and this is fueled by eugenics. So he basically wanted to make sure that the Aryan race, which is um, like blonde hair, blue eyes, is like the only race, or is like, clearly the top race at least, but basically just the only one. And on top of this, this kind of fuels, like eugenics fuels also like the Holocaust and other atrocities, which again, there's a bit of a section for that. But this is like a big reason why Hitler wanted to expand. He was trying to expand the land for the Aryan people. Um, and then appeasement, not directly a cause, but sort of like a delayer sort of thing, where um, the Allies basically didn't stop Hitler from gaining things like Austria, didn't stop him from gaining Czechoslovakia. They did actually have a conference without Czechoslovakia, of course, because, don't talk to them about their own lands. Um, but it was called the Munich Conference, and they basically the Allies were like, okay, hey, you can have the Sudetenland, but you can't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Sorry, mate. And Hitler's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do just that. You can go back to London now. So the ally, the specifically president of the or prime minister of the United Kingdom, he goes back to London and he's like, yeah, cool. We just avoided more conflict. And then of course Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia because what else is he gonna do? He's a liar. He's a pretty bad guy. I don't know how they didn't see that coming. Um, but this basically is what allows Hitler to gain a lot of his initial power. He is able to one kind of just take he kind of solidifies Germany, then he takes Austria, then he takes like half of Czechoslovakia, mainly just the part that's like modern day Czechia. Um, and like he just does this with literally no intervention apart from like a slightly basically just more finger wagging, just not from the League of Nations, just from like the Allied powers or who would become the Allied powers. So this just is like not an effective strategy in the slightest. They think it will be, and it isn't at all. So then we have conducting World War One or World War Two. Another total war, like World War One. Propaganda is like huge at this point. I actually have a couple things here, just about the different kinds of things. So these two are like total war, kind of building up the citizens. Obviously this one says our job keep them firing, so it's like, hey, we need to make more stuff for the army. This is obviously trying to convince people to like do their things for the industrial might. Then there's these two, which are for recruiting people. This one for the Navy, and this one for the Army, obviously. And then I have one just to show that this isn't all like America. There's a lot of German propaganda. This one, I don't know most of what it says, but I know right here it says Total War. Um, so obviously, I would assume basically just based off the images too. This guy just seems like a worker. So I would assume it's kind of still just advocating like, hey, do things for the army, kind of build up the power. And that becomes kind of a huge thing. There's some new technologies, lots of new technologies. So specialization of planes, actually development of jet aircraft happens here. The Germans get to it first, I believe. What is it? Not BF 109s. Oh, 161s. I believe they're called B. It's not BF 161. I just remember them as 161s. So they basically create the first jets. And then the actual important technology that you need to know, the atomic bomb is developed during this time. Mainly, well, there's kind of like a race to get to it first. And Hitler and like I guess the Nazis in general, they actually like realistically, not realistically, like theoretically, they would have gotten to it first. But the Allies were able to do a lot of sabotage efforts to stop that from happening, which was actually there's lots of really incredible stories about a lot of like their sabotage missions. But um, basically, the main one was about the Norsk Hydrofisk plant. They basically just destroyed the plant to actually like get the materials to test the atomic bomb like the effectiveness of it and how it would work. So the the Allied powers, specifically America, through Operation Manhattan, is actually able to get to it way first, like way faster because they are kind of more separated from sabotage. So they get it. They actually are the first to develop it and the first to use it twice. Also, the only people in history so far to use an atomic bomb, two of them. Um, then colonial troops once again called in, kind of the same effect as last time, honestly. I think slightly less are called in. Um, but I could be wrong about that. There's also a bit more like actual fighting outside of Europe. There obviously was in World War One too, but this is more a bit more, or just slightly more notable, I guess. Mainly because France is completely kicked out of Europe, so all of France is now free France, which is technically a different state, but it's France. Like the Allied France, and they are like basically only fighting outside of Europe. I mean, there's the French resistance obviously in Europe, and the French Free France is obviously sending people to Europe, but most of the actual big large scale fights are happening in Africa, mainly, and then like elsewhere around the world. Um, there's the mobilization. Mobilization of troops is interesting during this kind of area because fascist and communist states can do it really easily because they're dictatorships and they can kind of just say, "Hey, you're going to war now." They don't really like need the support of their people as much as a democracy does because obviously in democracy the people can just elect a new person. It's not as easy to do that in a dictatorship. Um, so there's a lot more like initial like kind of like the fascist and communist states seem initially way more powerful because people aren't really as excited to go into war. Not even excited. They're never excited. They're more like just less motivated, I guess is the better term. That to actually go to war. So the people in democracy, like democratical states, just don't do that. Democratical, democratic. um, so then a lot of nations actually join the Allies later. For a while, basically nothing happens because it's mainly just like the Battle of Britain, where there's like bombing efforts from the British, the RAF to Berlin, and from the Luftwaffe to London and like the countryside, and they're basically just bombing each other, but no like land developments really happen in Europe, at least between the Allies and the Axis. There's things getting conquered in the Balkans, though, things getting conquered a bit in Africa. Um, but it is around like later when the U.S. and other allies join that things kind of start going. Um, so the U.S. I think maybe this happens chronologically first, but whatever. The U.S. is joins the war because of Pearl Harbor, which I'm sure you know about, but basically the Japanese launch a surprise attack. They're brought into the war. The U.S. actually doesn't declare war on everybody. They just declare war on Germany, or not Germany, on Japan, and then Germany declares war on the U.S., which was kind of like a blunder on their part. But um, that basically brought the U.S. fully into the war. They weren't really wanting to still, but they were more just focused like, hey, we don't like Japan, but um, they are brought completely into the war after Pearl Harbor. And plenty of other allied nations, sort of similar. Um, most others aren't really provoked. They do kind of just join in later once they're either liberated or like once the situation becomes favorable enough for them to actually fight. Like Finland would join the Allies, um, like once they could actually fight back the Nazis and have like a chance. They like initially they kind of worked with the Nazis, especially like to fight back the Soviets, but they were really just doing it because they needed somebody to like fight the Soviets. So they just kind of like they hoped by the enemy of my enemy is your God. I'm so tired. The enemy the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Um, kind of idea. Also, plenty of other nations like kind of did similar stuff. U.S. Lend-Lease back here, kind of like bringing stuff over until they were brought into the war. There's a few new tactics. I believe both of these are in the curriculum. I know firebombing is. I don't know about Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is still important though. Basically, it was highly mobile war. This was obviously a German tactic, just based off the name. So it was mostly done through motorized infantry, which is basically just like trucks carrying soldiers. There's also like evidence that maybe the soldiers were like running, but they were like on drugs, so they could just do it really fast for whatever reason. I'm not completely sure if that's true, but I believe there is evidence for it. Um, then there's like motorized artillery, motorized like that kind of stuff, and then motorized armor or tanks. Basically everything is supposed to be going fast, 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 and it was supposed to basically just like pierce the enemy line so that it would spread the enemy thin, and you could get like a whole like kind of um, front line like favorable to yourself. And it was so fast. It was mostly done through surprise attacks because it was literally just so surprising when they were like there already. And then firebombing again. No, this one's in the curriculum. This was basically like they would kind of fire. They would like bomb using like napalm and stuff in a circle, and it would like kind of spread inwards, which made firebombing really really deadly because it was hard to escape. But it was used. I know it was used in Japan. There was firebombing raids before the atomic bombs. So Germany, like I said earlier, Germany is initially like looking like an easy victor here. The British are actually like they were maintaining a strong morale. They're doing probably the best they can, and how like dire the situation must have looked. But Germany was just looking so strong. They were like even among the Allies just considered to be the strongest army in the world. Like there wasn't really much debate because they were just kind of stronger for a lot of it. But then Germany also commits. They're really good at like messing up, which makes sense. There's also evidence that Hitler was on drugs every morning, so I don't know. That's the whole thing. Um, but they go through Operation Barbarossa, which they start around summer, and they try to attack. They break a peace treaty or not treaty, a truce with the Russians, the Soviet Union, and they try to invade and just try to take the Soviets out of the war. And that was kind of like, hey, we this is like going to be pretty big because then we have no threats in our back. However, they're not able to get through Russia fast enough, and then the Russian winter happens. And Russian winters are really brutal, especially because they are now trying to invade Russia with completely new technology that they have not like first they haven't like seen what could like possible issues could be. And like there's literally like the oil in their cars and tanks would freeze inside of their tanks while they were running. Like it that was how cold it got, and they just had no protection against like, heating that stuff. So they were told to like just kind of keep pushing, and that failed obviously because the Russians were much better at fighting in their own weather. Um, so they just opened the East Front, and the East Front is like the most deadly, like or kind of maybe not the most deadly. I think it is actually, but I guess it's better to know it just as like the scary front because nobody wanted to be sent to the Eastern Front. It was a bad area. But it was like since it was kind of so horrible for Germany, it was horrible for the Soviets too. But since it was so bad for Germany, it was like really really like hard for them to move forward, and that was like the first I guess like front of the downfall. Um, so then there were some invasions in Sicily, and then up through Italy, which is like the second front of the downfall, which was the southern front, trying to push through Italy, and then you have D-Day, which was obviously when they like hit the beaches of Normandy. So then that was like the third kind of front that opened up against Germany. And from there, it just kind of all went downhill because now the Germans were fighting on three separate fronts, and they were trying to push back like three basically different groups of invaders. Sicily and Normandy had similar sets, but they were sort of different. And that basically just spelled doom for Germany. There wasn't anything you could do fighting three fronts, and most Germans were also just tired at this point. Like war exhaustion was really high. So that kind of was what ended World War II on the European front, the Atlantic front. And then later we had Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day, which was basically Japan just kind of like they couldn't do anything after two atomic bombs hit them, obviously Nagasaki and Hiroshima. There was also an impending invasion on from Okinawa from the American forces, who were obviously the Operation Downfall, but the Soviets were also mounting an invasion of the Japanese mainland. So Japan just they kind of just surrendered at that point because they had two invasions pending and two massive bombs were just dropped on their cities, and they were being firebombed, and like there was a lot of fires because fire bombs do that. So they just kind of gave up at that point, um, which was kind of makes sense to give up. And then there's the genocides and atrocities. This is like the really sad part about um, this unit. So the probably the least known one. I guess I'd probably just do these in like orders of how well they're known, but I don't know. I'll just do them in like this. So the Armenian genocide. This was done by the Ottomans, and I believe the Armenians were Catholic or not Catholics. They were Christians at least. Um, I'm pretty sure. And the Young Turks and the Young Ottomans. No, Young Turks. The Young Turks were kind of scared that during the First World War, the Armenians were going to help the Allied powers and rise up against the Ottomans and try to like, start hurting them. So they committed like a horrible, like one of the worst, not one of the worst. It is a bad genocide. Um, it was a really horrible genocide against the Armenian people. Um, and it just killed like a lot of them. There's not really much else to say. It killed a lot of Armenian people. And it was done by the Ottomans. There's Holodomor, which, like I said, this was caused by the 5-year plan. Basically, the Soviets instituted collective farms, which instead of having like small private farms owned by individual people, they would bring them all together and like same amount of land, but it would be one big farm, and a bunch of people would live and work on that farm. However, because there was just one farm, it made it a lot easier to choose where that food was going. And during some bad harvests, not due to really anybody's faults, maybe sort of due just the collective farm not really working, but also just due it happened to be a bad harvest, the Soviets actually took so much food from the collective farms that were primarily in Ukraine, and they would they basically, whether intentionally or not, but likely intentionally, starved out the Ukrainians because they didn't have any food, and it was just going to soldiers and Russians over the Ukrainians. And Holodomor means death by hunger, um, and it was like just again another really really bad genocide done by the Soviets. Then there's obviously one of the worst ones. No, like the worst, honestly. Um, Genocide in history, which was the Holocaust. Most people have definitely heard about it and know a lot, but it killed about, I want to say, 11 million people, 6 million Jewish people, and 5 million people of like the other targeted groups, like homosexuals were part of it. There was Romanis were a part of it. Anybody with mental or physical disabilities were a part of it. Prisoners of war were a part of it. Political prisoners were, but usually to less like deadly. Sometimes they might have even been given special privileges, but they were still in the camps. And what they would do, they would like have two kind of separate kinds of camps. Some were there for labor, and some were done purely just to systematically kill whoever was targeted by whatever, like whoever was targeted in the Holocaust. Obviously, some of the most famous camps are like the Warsaw Camp, Warsaw Ghetto, and Auschwitz. And it's like people are just forced to work, and they're incredibly malnourished. The jobs are like literally backbreaking. Like people would suffer horrible injuries strictly just from the labor itself, let alone even all of the horrible treatment they were given to by the soldiers who were there. Some ghettos, like I forget which ones, but I know I've read stories. Like there was people would like line up, and people were like mauled by dogs. Sometimes it was like the conditions were some of the worst like possible. Um, it's hard to really imagine anything like worse than what they went through. All the survivors and all of those who died, and other camps were done. They would literally just be kind of put into situations where they just would be forced into death. There wasn't really even they weren't even used for labor. They were just killed. Um, this is basically known as like the pinnacle of human evil. Um, and then this was like also just a big motivation for the Allied powers to take down Germany, because people wanted to free. They didn't know much about what was really happening. I don't think the Allies, but they knew something bad was, and they kind of like were able to. use this as a bit of motivation, and they were able to liberate a lot of people who were still alive in the camps. Um, and then finally, there's the Japanese camps and imperial atrocities. The camps somewhat similar to the Holocaust, but usually just to less extreme. Um, they were just like less extreme, slightly. Not that's not much of a like good thing. They the labor was barely easier, and they were barely less cruel, but it was like basically just the same thing otherwise. Used to trap prisoners of war, used to trap races that were deemed lower, um, and they were often used for labor instead of, whereas the Holocaust was generally used for like things like resource gathering. The Some of the Japanese camps were still done for that, but also some were done for construction work, um, like just building like bridges and trains. Um, and then there's the imperial atrocities of Japan, like the Nanjing massacre, which they just like did horrible things to many of the Chinese people at Nanjing. Some were stabbed like literally over like 30 times. Um, and it was probably like one of it is known even today as like a horrible thing. It's influenced. I know it directly influenced relations, like widely and very strongly affected influences between China and Japan up until the 70s, and even now, there's still like if people do things that are seen as like disrespectful towards the event. I remember recently, not recently, but I guess what would be probably considered present day. Um, Within the curriculum. I know like there was a Japanese, I believe, prime minister who visited a shrine that was like not it wasn't honoring what the Japanese did, but it wasn't like it was kind of ignoring what they did. It was covering it up a bit, and China was rightfully very upset about that. Um, and it was just like one of the worst, um, like another one of just the worst things that happened during 1900s during the war, and honestly just during history in general. It was like a really horrible event. Um, but I mean, there's plenty of other mass atrocities and like genocides, but these are some of like the most important to know. Um, Apart from that, I do think that's basically it for Unit 7. I don't think I have much else to add to that. So sorry for making you listen to me yammer on for so long. Um, Bye bye. I hope wish you well on that test.